Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are listening us from around the world. It is my great pleasure to welcome you. My name is Francesco Sindico. I am the co-director of the Strathclyde Center for Environmental Law and Governance here at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. This is the 5th SCELG biennial lecture, and it happens in a very important week for the University of Strathclyde, the Engage Week. And first of all, I would like to thank the wonderful Engage team at the university who has very much supported SCELG and in the organization of this guest lecture. We have, the SCELG lecture happens every 2 years. We invite a distinguished guest, and this year we have an amazing colleague, Professor Christina Voigt, who will deliver her presentation, her talk, followed by also an amazing list of speakers. And my colleague Michael Melling will introduce them in turn in just a second. For those who do not know us, the Strathclyde Center for Environmental Law and Governance has been at the law school for almost 10 years now. And we are quite a big group now between staff and PhD researchers and so forth. There are 44 of us. And we cover a wide range of areas in environmental law and governance. Actually, we cover 16 areas. And my colleague, Kate McKenzie, in the chat will share some links and some information about the center, how to contact us if throughout the guest lecture you want to reach out. Climate change is one of our main areas. And obviously being in Glasgow and being climate change one of our main areas, COP26 is very much on our horizon. We are already planning, and we have already delineated a number of events, some of which with fantastic partners, such as Scottish Government, such as, for example, the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. And we are very, very excited to the number of events that we will be running at COP26. Climate change is not the only area, we have other areas, but another area that we do focus on climate is climate litigation, and we have something called the Climate Change Litigation Initiative, which again, Kate will put some information in the chat for those who are interested. Before I give the floor to Michael to moderate this exciting guest lecture that we have today, just some housekeeping. After a full year of COVID, we all know this, but I'll say it anyway. We have a chat, we have a Q&A. What do we use the chat for? The chat is there to introduce ourselves. If we want to know who's in the room with us, by all means, use it to say who you are and say welcome, say hi. It is also to share any resources, any information related to the topic of today's webinar. It's not a place to pose questions. We have a Q&A box, and that is where, if you want to send some information, pose a question to one of the speakers, please use the Q&A, and that will make it easier for Michael to actually moderate it and pose those questions. Just a few words about our moderator, Michael, Professor Michael Melling. He's a professor of practice at the University of Strathclyde Law School, member of SCELG, and a dear friend and colleague from many, many years. I can't think of a better person to moderate today's session. He knows the inside and outside of all climate and energy law matters that you can think of, and he has been at many COPs. So I really think we will learn a lot, not just from the speakers, from our keynote and from our colleagues who are following Christina, but also from Michael himself. So Michael, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for moderating today's session.
Thanks very much, Francesco. It's of course a pleasure to be participating in this with such an illustrious panel. And I will disagree with only one point. I think the vast bulk of expertise is with our panelists and of course with our keynote speaker. Let me say a few words maybe about the topic and why we chose it. So for the jurists among us, at least, you probably know Roscoe Pound, a legal theorist, and a term or sort of an expression that he coined almost a century ago, a famous distinction between law in books and law in action. And what separates those two is, of course, whether the subjects, the addressees of law, comply with it, whether we can observe such compliance and hold the actors accountable. This is a very important concern, usually at the microcosm, Roscoe Pound and others, of individual compliance with tax law, penal law, traffic rules, etc. Well, the stakes are immeasurably much higher when you're talking about the conduct of nations, and not only of nations in any issue area, but in an issue area that we increasingly recognize might be one of the most daunting challenges that humanity has ever faced, namely climate change. Not only is it important to understand whether countries, states are living up to their responsibilities, whether they are adhering to their obligations under international climate law, but also the self-declared pledges that they have committed to in international climate cooperation. But it's also immeasurably more difficult to do so, given how political, how contentious, and generally how states sort of are very reluctant to surrender what they think of as their sovereignty on these issue areas. So the stakes are very, very high, but it's also particularly difficult and intractable an issue area to talk about accountability, about compliance, and about transparency. And I think in the run-up to COP26 in Scotland this year, where some of these issues will feature very prominently on the agenda, I couldn't imagine a better time to discuss this topic, but I also couldn't imagine a better panel to share with us their insights, their experience, their expertise on the topics. First, of course, this is the 5th SCELG Biennial Guest Lecture, as Francesco mentioned, and this lecture, this keynote, if you like, is being delivered by Christina Voigt. I've known Christina for almost 2 decades, kind of scary to think about that. When we were at the time researching what was still a very early and nascent field, climate law, boy, the world has changed. Christina is now a professor of law at the University of Oslo, but she has studied, researched, and taught law all around the world, truly a global jurist, from New Zealand all the way to Hawaii, held several important positions as a legal advisor and a negotiator for the government of Norway, for instance, including in the Paris negotiations at COP21 6 years ago in 2015. She holds senior functions in the World Commission on Environmental Law of the IUCN and is generally a very recognized expert on international climate law and issues of compliance, specifically and importantly, because she's also co-chair of the Compliance and Facilitation Committee of the Paris Agreement, from which she will share with us a lot of the developments that are happening and are very much underway right now, because it is really just getting operational as we speak. Then in alphabetical sequence, she will be followed by a panel, and I'll introduce them alphabetically, that will again share both from their experience, from their expertise, in many cases very practical, very relevant work. Let's start with our own Strathclyde's Professor Keith Bell, who is a professor at the University of Strathclyde, an engineer, but he will, I think, be speaking primarily from his role as a member of the UK Climate Change Committee, or Committee on Climate Change, which is a body, a formal body set up by the Climate Change Act to scrutinize to some extent and comment on what the UK government is doing, and to some extent hold it accountable. And he'll, I hope, then share more insights from his work. He also co-directs the UK Energy Research Centre, along with a number of other accolades. Then we also have Gerard Howe of the Scottish Government, as Francesco mentioned, where he leads and is Deputy Director in the Scottish Government for COP26 and international climate change. So he really is the person in the Scottish Government, which, if you like, is the host of COP26, in charge of making sure that we have, the right environment, the right context for these difficult negotiations. He's got a long and illustrious career in the UK government, working previously with the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and I think the Department for International Development, and in civil society. Again, a lot of very relevant and deep expertise on today's topic. And alphabetically last, but certainly not least in importance, is Professor Jimena Nieto Carrasco, who is currently a professor in international environmental law in various universities in Bogota, Colombia, including Universidad de los Andes, that I think many of us have heard of. But she was a civil servant in the Colombian government for 2 decades, working at the Ministries of Environment and Foreign Affairs there, helped negotiate, among other things, Article 15, the article on compliance and facilitation in the Paris Agreement. And she's in the compliance committees of more international environmental treaties than I care to list here. Suffice it to say, a global expert on issues of compliance, accountability, and transparency as well. So all in all, I think we couldn't have a better panel and a better keynote speaker to guide us through this difficult topic. But enough with the introduction. I will now hand over to Christina. Thank you all, of course, for joining us and sharing your expertise, especially to you, Christina, for joining from Oslo with your 5th biennial SCELG guest lecture The floor is yours, and I think you will share the screen for slides.
Well, thank you so much, Michael and Francesco, for your kind introductions. Thank you also to the University of Strathclyde Center for Environmental Law and Governance for organizing this series of biennial lecture. Of course, it is a great honor and a great privilege, but also a great joy for me to be here today, to be invited. Thank you so much. It is also because it is about a topic which is very dear to my heart, and it's something that I've been working on for a long time. So all this together is it's an immense privilege for me to be here. And I am also very much looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists, from Jimena and Gerard and Keith after the lecture. I'm very curious about your insights and your views, and I'm also looking very much forward to sharing questions and answers with the audience. I'll try to share my screen now, see if this works well. Could you just confirm, Michael or Francesco, if this is visible? Well. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
So what I will be talking about today, as Michael already indicated, is the question of what is parties' accountability under the Paris Agreement. And the reason for why I chose this topic is that if you talk about the Paris Agreement, or in my experiences talking about or teaching about the Paris Agreement, I've always, or very many times, been met with criticism about the agreement, that it's weak and it's just bottom up and there is no real accountability for parties' performance. And this lecture today is meant to rebut and diffuse to a certain extent this criticism, because there is much more in the agreement than maybe what hits the eye at a first glimpse. And I would like to highlight and sketch out the elements in the agreement that are legally binding, that are mandatory, and how accountability is structured throughout the agreement. It's really a journey throughout the entire agreement, and I invite you to join me on that journey. What I'll be doing today is, first, I'd like to say a couple of words about what is accountability, so that we have a common starting ground on that multifaceted term. And then I'll look into three aspects of accountability. One refers to the nationally determined contributions, the communication and the information that parties need to provide. And then I'll say briefly a couple of words about transparency, the transparency framework, which is also in a way an accountability mechanism. Before then I'll zoom in on compliance and talk about the compliance committee, of which, as Michael mentioned, I'm currently the co-chair. And I'll provide a summary, and hopefully that enables us to stimulate some discussion. Now, I also wanted to point out that this lecture is partly based on a paper that I had the privilege of publishing with Jiang Gao. Jiang Gao was and is the co-facilitator for the negotiations on the transparency framework. He was that all the way from Paris to the adoption of the rulebook in Katowice. So he's seen everything and anything about the transparency negotiations. And I had the privilege of being the co-facilitator on the modalities and procedures for the compliance committee. So the two of us, we followed the negotiations from the inside, and we thought it might be helpful to put our heads together and look at the interlinkages between transparency and compliance in the Paris Agreement and share this with the rest of you. So you have the reference here if you should be interested in this paper. Now, accountability is a broad term. It's like justice or sustainability. You can put a lot into it. In generally, it means answerability for actions. Now, under international law, you can adopt a very narrow view on it, something that goes along the lines of just the right to limit power. Now, this is not the understanding which I will put into this term here in the context of this presentation. Rather, I'll adopt a broader understanding, something like the responsibility of states for their actions in accordance with agreed standards and rules, in particular also when it comes to providing insight and transparency. In the context of the pairs agreement and in the context of the paper that Gao and I wrote, we adopted the understanding of accountability as answerability of parties for aspects of their performance, not for their entire performance, but certain aspects of their performance in accordance with the provisions of the pairs agreement and in relation to the mechanisms and procedures that are established under the agreement. Now, what we discovered in our work was that we have increasing degrees of accountability. There are certain elements that have weak accountability. It's still, parties are accountable to a certain extent, but it's fairly weak. Then there are medium elements, and then there are stronger elements, not the strongest you can possibly imagine, but still stronger than some of the others. And I'll, in a very simplified manner, adopted this traffic light approach here for green, weak, medium, orange, and stronger than the red elements. And you'll see this throughout my presentation that I follow this color code in a way. There's also an accountability continuum, which means that some elements go through the entire cycle of the pairs agreements processes and come up again and again in different steps and with different accountability elements attached to it. In order to come to some sort of conclusion on the strength of accountability, we adopted or we analyzed accountability in relation to three elements that you see here at the bottom of the slide. One is whether there are rules, binding rules or guidance for parties, which then can be obeyed or not obeyed, and establishing accountability. The second element is whether there is some independent means for review on how parties are performing. And the third element was whether there are actually any measures that could be applied to parties in case of non-performance. And according to these three elements, we assessed the different elements in the agreement. Now, just very brief, some words about the importance, I'm sorry, that was one too far, the importance of transparency in the agreement. Now, transparency is significantly important because it is something that provides clarity on the contribution of each party, both towards the collective goals of the agreement. I wrote here temperature goal, but it applies to all goals of the agreement, as well as for being able to track progress of how each and every party is doing in achieving and implementing its NDC. The second reason why transparency is important is that because it builds mutual trust. I think that was something that was crucial in the negotiations in Paris, that transparency is important to create mutual trust and confidence, and also, of course, to provide a means for effective implementation of the agreement. But there are two more elements that flow out of publicly available information. And one is that it does enable peer pressure, which is one of the enhancing tools or built-in tools in the pairs agreement, that parties can look at each other's performance based on the publicly available information. And that in turn facilitates the improvement of their performance and the increase in ambition. And second, it enables, of course, also the engagement of the public, both in domestic decision-making or in praising or criticizing what parties do, other parties do internationally, all based on the availability of information, which is part and parcel or the heart of the transparency regime under the Paris Agreement. On the importance of compliance, that's a little bit different, but compliance is crucially important for the effective functioning of the agreement. There are a number of core legal obligations, and I'll come back to which ones they are, which are simply the backbone of the agreement, without which the Paris Agreement would not work. So therefore, it is absolutely crucial that parties comply with those obligations. And that was something that parties recognized as important already in Paris when the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change decided to include a compliance, implementation and compliance mechanism into the architecture, into the structure of the Paris Agreement in Article 15. And Jimena was very crucial in these negotiations, and maybe we hear a little bit more about it in her talk later. Compliance is the way it is structured, and I'll explain this in much more detail later in my talk. It is facilitative. It's not a punitive mechanism. It is facilitative because there's always a trade-off that you have to make in these negotiations between the inclusion of a compliance element and the stringency of other provisions, legally binding provisions in the agreement, and the question how many parties are then willing to join the agreement. So it was a very sensitive weighing and balancing of interest. And the compromise that was found was, yes, parties agreed to have a compliance mechanism, but it is facilitative in nature. Compliance, or something that actually looks at the compliance of parties, is also meant to enhance trust and confidence of parties that they actually do what they signed up to. And if not, that there is a mechanism designed for exactly this purpose to hold parties accountable for their performance in light of the very nature of the relevant provisions of the agreement. Now, when I talked about this accountability continuum, these are the three elements that we analyzed in our paper, where we looked at the accountability for parties submitting their NDC and the information that needs to accompany the NDC. And then we moved towards the transparency framework. And then finally, the compliance committee. And we, of course, discovered that there are differing degrees of accountability, increasing in strength from the NDC information through the transparency framework, and then finally to the compliance committee. Now let me zoom into this question of accountability for the NDCs and the communication and provision of information that is supposed to come with it. As we all know, the NDCs are the crucial elements of the agreement. Each party shall prepare, communicate, and maintain an NDC. Where the legal obligation really only is to have an NDC, to communicate it and to maintain it, but parties are not legally obliged to achieve it, to achieve the targets that they put into it. And that is indicated by the word that it intends to achieve. It's only intentional, but the question whether a party has or has not an NDC, that is a matter of legal obligation. In addition to that core legal obligation, there are certain expectation. One is that parties, NDCs will represent a progression. So each time parties communicate an NDC, it is supposed to go beyond the previous one, and that each NDC reflects the party's highest possible ambition. It's written down in Article 4, paragraph 3. Now, when communicating an NDC, parties have to provide information that is necessary for the clarity, transparency, and understanding of the NDC. And this is actually also a legally binding obligation. It's written in Article 4, paragraph A, which says all parties shall provide information necessary and so forth. There is guidance on what kind of information parties shall provide. That's part of the Katowice rulebook for the implementation of the Paris Agreement in Decision 4, CMA 1. The NDCs, including that information, is also made publicly available on the interim registry, but there is only weak accountability for this under the Paris Agreement. And why is this? While there is guidance for information, and I said it's a legally binding obligation, there is no mechanism under the Paris Agreement that actually reviews whether parties communicated that information necessary for clarity, transparency, and understanding. It's not there. there is no review mechanism established under the general architecture of the Paris Agreement. You can ask, was that oversight or was it intentional? It's hard to decide in hindsight. The fact is, it's not there. Neither is there any review possibility for progression or highest possible ambition, the elements in Article 4.3, or whether the NDC has an absolute economy-wide target for developed countries, or other elements that follow from Article 4.4. So there's no review mechanism under the Paris Agreement, and of course then also no measures if a party does not follow the guidance for information, even though it is a legally binding obligation. The second aspect, transparency. The transparency or enhanced transparency framework was established under Article 13 of the Paris Agreement. And it was decided in Katowice at the latest that each party shall provide or submit what is now called a biennial transparency report, a BTR. We haven't seen any yet because the first BTRs are expected to be submitted in 2024, so that's still to come. But the content of what the BTRs are supposed to contain is very clearly outlined in the Katowice rulebook, in the modalities, procedures, and guidelines, the MPGs, for reporting. That's decision 18 CMA 1. Now, the BTR is in a way just the outer shelf of what parties are supposed to report on. What the legal obligations are several elements that need to go into the BTR. There are mandatory requirements, mandatory elements, which have to be part and parcel of each biannual transparency report. And there are three mandatory requirements. One is that each party has to provide a national greenhouse gas inventory report every other year. Each party has to provide information that makes it possible to track progress in implementing and achieving its NDC. And finally, for developed country parties, it is mandatory to provide information on the support provided to developing countries. So these are the elements that have to go into the biennial transparency report, and these are legally binding obligations. So each party every other year has to provide these reports. And as I said, it's not in motion yet, but it's something that we will see kicking into motion from 2024 onwards. In addition, there are voluntary elements that parties may want to include, and I listed them below, but they are not legally binding. That is up to parties themselves, whether they want to include information, for example, an adaptation or other elements. Now, that's not all about the transparency framework. A very important second element is that each biannual transparency report by each party will go through an independent technical expert review. So the technical expert teams, which will be put together by the Secretariat, chosen from a roster of experts, they will look at whether the information that parties provided in their BTRs is consistent with the guideline for reporting. They will not look, for example, whether the NDC is adequate or whether the support provided is enough or something, but they will look at whether the reporting was done in a way that is consistent with how reporting is supposed to be done in accordance with the Katowice rulebook. The technical expert review teams will also look at a consideration of parties' implementation and achievement of the NDC. That's going to be very interesting to see how the TERs, the technical expert review teams, are going to deal with that. They will look at the support provided, and they will identify areas of improvement in each technical expert review report. The report will contain recommendations for the mandatory requirements or encouragements for those elements that are not mandatory non-shall provisions. And finally, each party, after the technical expert review report has been finalized, is supposed to go through what is called a facilitative multilateral consideration of progress, an FMCP, which is also a legally binding requirement because it says each party shall participate in the FMCP in Article 13, paragraph 1. So this is how the transparency timeline looks. It starts with the submission of the BTR, which then goes to the technical expert review. Then the technical expert review teams come with their report. And finally, parties are supposed to participate at the FMCP. And that applies to each party. And it happens every other year. So it's quite a logistical endeavor that parties set up for themselves. And we will only know from 2024 onwards how this is going to play out. Now, with regard to transparency, Gao and I, we found that here we have stronger accountability or medium accountability. We have guidance, we have modalities, procedures, and guidelines for how reporting is supposed to be done. It's a legally binding requirement. There is a review, yes, through the technical expert review teams, and there are certain measures that can be applied in terms of recommendations or encouragements by the TERs. Now, this is, however, where it stops. The technical expert review teams can only recommend something or can only encourage something, but they cannot follow up on whether the party actually does what they recommended or encouraged. This is really where the transparency regime stops, the transparency framework stops. And this is also where the compliance aspect starts. And I'll come back to that in a second. This leaves us to the third aspect of accountability, and of course, the one that I'm working most with these days, the Implementation and Compliance Committee. As I already mentioned, parties established this mechanism, which is supposed to consist of a committee already in the Paris Agreement itself in 2015, in Article 15, which talks about a committee to facilitate implementation of and promote compliance with the provisions of the Paris Agreement. And from this formulation alone, you probably see that the mandate and the role of the committee is wider than strict compliance. It also deals with implementation challenges. It deals with facilitation, and I'll come back to how the committee is considering currently of how this is supposed to be done. Importantly, the committee is facilitative in nature. It's supposed to work in a transparent manner, but it's important to note that it is supposed to be non-adversarial, non-punitive. It shall not function as an enforcement or dispute settlement mechanism. It is not allowed to impose sanctions or penalties and shall respect national sovereignty. So the question is, does the committee have teeth? As Jimena always pointed out, that the committee should have teeth, and we'll see whether the committee has some teeth or not in the course of the next couple of slides. Just about the committee itself, the composition of the committee was already decided in Paris itself, in the decision that accompanied the Paris Agreement, where it says that the Commission has 12 members. 12 members, yes, 12 members, 2 members each from the main UN regions, so 2 from the African groups, 2 from the Asia Pacific, and so forth, and 1 member each from small island developing states and from least developing countries. So these are 12 members. There was also the goal of gender balance, and it was important that the committee covers a range of different expertise. So it's not just lawyers that sit in that committee, but they also have to have scientific, technical, socioeconomic backgrounds and so forth. In addition to the 12 members, we also have 12 alternates. So by the end of the day, we are 24 people that are supposed to compose the committee. Now, I just included here a screenshot from yesterday of how the committee is currently composed. You see the list of members. You also see that for some regions, nominations are still pending. For example, for Grulac, we only have an alternate member currently who, of course, functions as a member in the absence of members for this region. And we have 1 vacant seat for Eastern Europe. The members were elected at COP I forgot the number. I'm sorry, in Madrid in 2019, COP25, I guess it was. And we met for the first time only last year. The first meetings of the committee were last year and this year. And this means we've only so far met in a virtual setting. So this committee has never met in person, which is of course quite unfortunate because we have a lot of work to do currently, and I'll tell you what we're doing. I'll also point out that Mr. Hasib Gohar from Pakistan and myself, we were elected last June as the first inaugural co-chairs of the committee. Now, how can an issue actually come to the committee? How can the committee become active? And there are three ways of how an issue can come, or in case if you want to can come to the committee. First is that any party at any time can bring its own challenges with implementation or compliance to the committee. There's always the possibility of self-referral of a party with in the context of its own performance. Whether this is ever going to happen or not is something that stands to be seen, but it is there as a possibility. The second one, and this is really important for lawyers, is that there is the committee will become, I just said automatically, but the committee will become active in the case of a violation of core legal obligations. In these cases, the committee doesn't have discretion. It will take up these issues. Of course, it's not automatic. There's still people that are there, but the committee will take this up. And I have on my next slide, which are these core obligations. And third, the committee has a discretion on whether to initiate proceedings where a party has reported under the transparency framework in a manner that showed consistent and persistent inconsistencies with the reporting guidance. And the technical expert review teams have many times or several times pointed this out, but in a way nothing happened. And this is in a way the backstop to the transparency framework, where the technical expert review teams, they cannot do more than providing these recommendations. But if nothing happens, the committee can become active, but this only with the consent of the party concerned. And this is maybe the most important list that lawyers and everybody dealing with the Paris Agreement needs to know, because these are these modalities for this automatic initiation of issues by the Implementation and Compliance Committee. These are the core legal obligations, and if a party has not complied with them, the committee will initiate consideration of these issues. And you see in these numbers 1 to 4, that deals with situations where a party has not communicated or maintained an NDC. It doesn't look on whether it's what it says in the NDC, but just the question, is there an NDC, yes, or is there none, no? Is it 1-0 or binary decision? And if there is no NDC in the registry, then the committee will become active. The same applies to the mandatory elements in the biannual transparency report, the BTR. I told you there are 3 elements that are mandatory, and if they're not there, the committee will get active. The third element is if a party does not participate at the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress. And finally, for developed country parties that have not submitted their information on projected levels of finance to developing countries under paragraph 9.5, if that communication is missing, this will also become an issue for the Implementation and Compliance Committee to take up. This is just for you a screenshot of that backstop to the transparency framework, where the committee may, with the consent of the party concerned, can engage in facilitative considerations in cases where we have significant and persistent reporting inconsistencies, and the technical expert review teams have pointed this out in their recommendations. Then the committee can take this up and get in contact and dialogue with the party concerned. Very importantly, the committee will not assess or address the content of these reports, whether it is the NDC or the biannual transparency report or the 9.5 communication. The committee will only look at whether it's there or not, but in a way it will not open the book and look at what it's inside. This is not of the concern of the committee. And then, of course, the question is, what can the committee do? It is obliged to take appropriate measures in relation to the individual case it works on. And it has a whole toolbox of measures which were already decided in the Pairs Agreement Rulebook. In paragraph 30 of decision 20 CMA1, the committee will, of course, always engage in a dialogue with the party to find out what is the problem, how did you end up in the situation, what can we do, what kind of recommendations could solve the situation. But importantly, the committee can also assist the party in its engagement with the support arrangement, which is financial capacity building or technological support of the mechanisms that are established under the Paris Agreement. For example, the Paris Committee for Capacity Building, or the Green Climate Fund, or the Adaptation Fund, or whatever you may want to consider. The Compliance Committee can assist in engagement with these relevant bodies. Further, the committee will and can also recommend the development of an action plan, asking the party of how it intends to get back into compliance, and also follow up on the implementation of that plan. And importantly, for those legally binding obligations, so if a party is not in compliance with these core legal obligations that were listed in one of the previous slides, the committee can issue a finding of fact, which is a public statement in relation to the performance of an individual party with regard to these core legal obligations. And this is perhaps the most biting measure that the committee can adopt. It doesn't get any stronger than that, but as we know, in international relations and diplomacy, parties do not like to be called upon, and they do not like to be hanged out there with a statement of facts, and it actually may have much more teeth than what the simple wording suggests. We try to provide a very simple overview, and I'm almost at the end of my presentation here, but this is only to guide you through how this all links to each other, and maybe it is helpful with a visual overview. Let's see how that goes. As I said, the situation for developed country parties, if they have submitted their financial communication under Article 9.5, that's good. If they didn't, this issue goes directly to the Compliance Committee, the Article 15 Committee. The same with an NDC. If a party communicated and maintained an NDC, that's wonderful. If it didn't, the committee will address this issue and take it up. If there is an NDC, of course, then parties are expected and required to report on it through the BTR. And as I said, the BTR needs to contain the mandatory element of the National Inventory Report, progress information, and for developed countries report on support provided. If the BTR is missing in its entirety, or if some of the mandatory elements are missing, this is an issue for the committee. It will go straight to the committee. If the BTR is fine, it goes to the technical expert review. And if the technical expert review report identifies or gives indications of significant and persistent inconsistencies in reporting in their recommendations, and the party concerned consents to it, then this also can go to the committee. So this is quite a cumbersome link, but we'll see if a party ever gets, or if a case ever gets to the committee on this issue. And finally, the FMCP. If a party participates, it's fine. If not, then the committee will take this up. And of course, there are certain aspects to it with regard to the measures that can be applied. But the black box is the transparency framework. And this is a way we tried to visualize of how the transparency framework links up with the compliance committee. It's a little bit complicated, but maybe this makes it a little bit more easier to comprehend. So finally, when it comes to compliance, what we see is that the accountability is here stronger. It's not the strongest that you can possibly imagine, but it has stronger elements than for the NDC communication or transparency, because We have guidance on compliance. Of course, that's the guidance for the main provisions under the Paris Agreement. But we have an independent review mechanism. That's the standing committee, the compliance committee, which looks at the performance of parties with regard to their core legal obligations, or on measures or issues of significant and persistent inconsistency. And finally, something that I haven't mentioned yet, I'll drop it here. The committee can also look at systemic issues that do not relate to individual parties' performance, but where it sees that this, the same issue comes up for a number of parties, indicating that there may be something more systemic in the rules of the Paris Agreement, and can bring this issue to the CMA. And there are certain measures. I gave you the whole toolbox that the committee can adopt. There's all sorts of things that the committee can take. This list is, by the way, not exclusive. There may be other elements that the committee, in the course of its work, considers appropriate and can add. And the question now, does the committee have teeth? Well, maybe not the strongest one. But as I said, this issue of findings of fact may be already something that parties may not like to see, and rather comply than having the committee issuing this. But there's also very interesting development recently, where we have, for example, this situation where under Article 6.2, these are the cooperative approaches, bilateral cooperative approaches for market cooperation under the Paris Agreement, where we still are missing rules, but some countries are coming forward with their independent agreements. And this is the agreement between Switzerland and Peru, which was adopted last year on cooperative approaches under Article 6, paragraph 2. And interesting, this agreement actually links back to the Article 15 in the context of possibility of suspension of the recognition of transfers of these units that can be traded between two countries. And you see here in Article 20, paragraph 1, it says that any party, well, in this case, it's Peru and Switzerland, may suspend the recognition of transfer if the other party is in non-compliance with Article 4.2, that's the NDC issue, whereby the consideration of that non-compliance issue should be based on the relevant consideration by the committee established under Article 15. So that's the compliance committee. And that's actually something that we did discuss in the context of the negotiation, that non-compliance should also maybe lead to non-eligibility to participate in Article 6. We never got there. But the interesting development is now that parties do individually refer to the compliance committee's findings and include it in their bilateral agreements. So that's like, giving teeth to the committee through the back door, or whatever you want to call it. What is the committee currently doing? We have a very concrete mandate to develop our rules of procedure, which are supposed to be adopted by the CMA in Glasgow. So this is one of the decisions that the CMA has to take. And the committee is working very hard on it. Actually, yesterday and the day before, we had a meeting. It went until 3 a.m. this morning. That's why I'm a little tired today, where we worked on the rules of procedure. So the committee will provide a draft for its procedural rules to be adopted in Glasgow. And as I mentioned, we only work virtually. We haven't met in person, which is, of course, unfortunate. For people who some know each other from before, but many don't know each other, and it's not really helpful if you can't even chat over coffee or dinner and establish that kind of commonality in working. When will the committee consider its first issue? We don't know that yet, but of course we hope that the rules of procedure will be adopted in Glasgow, and then we are ready to go. We are ready to be up and running. I just hop over this because I think my time is up. My very last slide deals with the expectations for COP26 and, of course, CMA 3, which is the relevant governing body for the compliance committee. There are a number of outstanding issues with regard to the rulebook of the Paris Agreement. Everybody talks about Article 6, but there's more to it that hopefully will be decided in in Glasgow. One outstanding element, which actually is quite crucial, are common timeframes for the NDCs. That's something that is missing. It's a bit of a mess currently because some parties have 5 years, others have 10-year timeframes. Doesn't seem to be a problem, but it would be much easier if they all had the same timeframes. So we'll see if parties are able to agree on common timeframes. There are also negotiations of more technical nature on common reporting tables for these biennial transparency report, because it will be very important to see how parties actually are supposed to be reporting. And there are negotiations on the outline for the technical expert review reports. And from what I said very early, this is of course important for the compliance committee because it will link up to the technical expert review reports, and it will have or needs an understanding of how these reports are outlined. As I already mentioned, the rules of procedure for the committee will hopefully be adopted by CMA3 in Glasgow. But in addition to these technical elements, of course, there is much more to be expected from Glasgow, not alone the communications on 9.5, the projected levels of finance. They've come in, some came in last year, the most came in early this year, but it is a very important piece of information. And some parties have not yet submitted their 9.5 communication. It's going to be very interesting to watch that space. And of course, we all know that there's a very strong recommendation and request by the CMA to parties to update and enhance their NDCs. And of course, this is not necessarily something that the committee will look at, but it will follow very closely on how parties are doing. And this is where I finished my presentation. I think that was the last slide. Yes, and I'm very much looking forward to questions from the audience and my fellow panelists. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Christina. Thank you very much. And you were perfect on time. I think every minute was worth it. I haven't seen as clear an overview and explanation of this very complex process. Lots of acronyms, lots of procedures. And I think what you also conveyed very importantly is what an evolution we've seen in international relations from the traditional sort of binary breach of treaty or not 50, 60, 70 years ago to this nuanced, sophisticated, complex set of procedures and encouragements and so on and so forth. Before we go to the panel, I want to remind everybody in the audience that you can enter questions in the Q&A already. We already have a few questions and we will be getting to them once the panel has had a chance to give sort of reactions to Christina and some impulse statements. So please take advantage of that, especially if you have questions for Christina now that you might otherwise forget or not remember exactly. Go ahead and enter them and we will get to them. And remember, the chat is more for introducing yourself, for announcements, etc., also from the team here about important links and links to publications, etc. You might have seen that Kate already, for instance, linked to the article that Christina mentioned previously. Now I'd like to proceed to the panel round. And of course, Christina, you're very much still part of the event. So at the end, I'll also give you an opportunity to respond to sort of the reactions. But what I'd like to do is take it from the global, which is where Christina started, all the way down to the local. And that shuffles up our sequence a little bit from the alphabetical sequence in which I introduced the panelists. We will start with Jimena, who, as you recall, I introduced as a former government official in Colombia, an academic, but also somebody who's been heavily involved in negotiations and the practice of compliance monitoring and enforcement, if one can say that, in international environmental law. Jimena, to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to the Strathclyde Center for Environment for inviting me. It's both a pleasure and a challenge to try to respond to Christina's presentation, because, as you said, it was very, very comprehensive and clear. So I would like to just speak a little bit more about that history that she mentioned behind the negotiating process, and also about how this work in practice in other environmental agreements, because that experience might feed into what Christina was saying. It might be the future of the committee. So in that sense, the history first, and because, as you rightly pointed out, Michael, when you said that states are in general reluctant to these mechanisms in general, because of course, Christina mentioned they don't like to be pointed out. This was a very difficult sell during the negotiations. No, at the beginning, when we started talking about the possibility of a compliance committee, we had few friends. And although I have to say that Christina was one of the friends from the beginning, as well as other developed country parties, but inside the G77 and China, which, as you know, is the group of developing nations in the negotiations, there was no more appetite for a compliance committee. And so we have a difficult job there, trying to convince them why it was important to add this to the transparency framework. Of course, EOSIS, the small island developing states, were with us very soon, but for the others it was more difficult. What is kind of funny at the end is that after having work on legal arguments, why it was important, why we needed this body for the Paris Agreement, at the end, the shallowest argument of all was the one that I feel prevailed, which was basically to ask negotiators, okay, one question that you're going to get when you go back home, and this I developed inspired by my students, which always ask me the same question. One question that you are going to get when you go back home is, what happens if a country does not comply? What are you going to answer to that? Are you going to say, oh, nothing, pacta sunt servanda, as us lawyers know, means the treaties are to be complied with, and that will not be a sufficient question for everyone. So at the end, I think that argument of being able to answer that question, what happens if a country does not comply with the obligations under the Paris Agreement, was the one that I guess helped us establish this committee. You saw that Christina mentioned different let's say functions of the committee of what compliance meant and how this issue was addressed. I think one that reflects very nicely also what the committee is intended to is when you translate it to French, when you translate compliance in French, it means le respect des obligations. That means respecting obligations, and I think that's a very powerful message there, because that's what we want, that parties comply and have a respect for the obligations. As Christina was saying, this would benefit everyone. At the end, that was also a very convincing argument. It will be for all of us to know that our neighbor will also be in compliance, and if not, then there's something that we can do. That was really important. And I also want to say that this was only the second time where the committee was established in the treaty itself. And because usually what we have done, for example, in the Kyoto Protocol or in other legal instruments, was that the treaty only called for the establishment at a later stage of this committee, and it was not until the Minamata Convention on Mercury that was agreed in 2013, where there we managed to get the establishment of the committee in the treaty itself, trying to avoid lengthy years of negotiations, just trying to agree on the membership and other like nitty-gritty issues related to the committee. So it was great that in the Paris Agreement also we managed to have this Article 15, which also defines membership, as Christina established. And I think that was a really good point, because if not, we would have been at this stage, we would have been only discussing the possibility of eventually establishing a compliance committee, and it could have been years only for that. So the fact that it was established established at the treaty means that Christina and the members are already working on rules of procedure and actually looking forward to have their next case there. In that, and because I know I only have a few minutes, I also would like to refer to how it works in practice, because as Christina was pointing out, these committees are not meant to be punitive. Even the word sanction, it's absolutely not that's something that you should mention, because that's what's the parties are very reluctant to hear, and in this legal context, it would not be sanctions. As she said, it was not adversarial, facilitative, non-punitive, and the way I've seen this work is basically that you call upon a party and you say, are you having trouble complying? What are your circumstances? Why we've noticed that you haven't complied with this and this, and that mere fact of calling the party and that the party knows that there is someone looking after what they are doing, that is a very effective mechanism in itself. And one shouldn't also underestimate the fact that the committee, although it cannot sanction, although we couldn't, we were thinking when we were negotiating it, we were thinking about possible measures for parties in non-compliance. And Christina mentioned the fact that, for example, to say that you will not be able to use the mechanisms under Article 6, which is something that that we can do under the Kyoto Protocol Compliance Committee. But here, as I said, it was a very difficult environment to get to that, but we at least managed that last consequence of non-compliance, as if I made that Christina was mentioning, which is the finding of facts. In a way, the fact that the committee can say, after careful consideration, after years of discussing this, we can conclude that this party is not doing what they are supposed to do. That in itself can be of a great efficacy, and I've seen it work in other treaties. Is what we call name and shame, and I know that can be very sensible as well. But the only fact that the committee will say, okay, after careful and years of consideration, we find this. That can be very strong, because no party wants to be in that situation. So do not underestimate that. And I will finish with this. As Christina pointed out, the name of the committee, it's important, because when you read at the first line of Article 15, it says that it's to facilitate implementation and promote compliance. For us, the promote compliance is that part that will allow the committee to find facts of non-compliance, and eventually, as I said, report to the to the CMA, sorry, and say, this party, we find this, and the fact of naming that party will be very, very, very effective in itself. So I think I will leave it at that for now, and of course I'm ready for questions or exchanges later on. Thank you very much, Mike.
Muchas gracias, Jimena. And I think, just to echo what you said, with naming and shaming being proven to be very effective, just in recent years, I think we've all seen how powerful the court of public opinion is, not only vis-a-vis governments, corporations as well, for instance. Let me turn to the national level, speaking about accountability at the national level, and to Keith, Professor Keith Bell, who works on energy and energy engineering at Strathclyde, but as he also, as I mentioned in the introduction, is a member of the Committee on Climate Change set up by legislation in the UK, and which also plays an important role in bringing attention to what the government is doing and how it is faring, how it is performing in meeting statutory requirements. Keith, to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. And yeah, thanks to Christina and Jimena for their remarks. As Michael says, let's try and bring it back to a sort of a national level. I'm delighted. It looks like in the attendance participant list, lots of participants here from all around the world. So it's fantastic to welcome you to this event. So, the UK context was very much defined what we have now by the Climate Change Act that was passed in 2008. And it, among other things, established the Committee on Climate Change, as it's been called most of the time. Actually, just recently we've subtly changed our name to the Climate Change Committee, slightly shorter. But that was instrumental in setting a long-term goal for emissions reduction. And the establishment of the CCC, the Climate Change Committee, enables this kind of monitoring, especially of what the UK government is doing. And the other features of that act were to identify credible pathways to a long-term goal. It requires a definition of that long-term goal, credible pathways to achieve it, and then also requires the government to define policies which should achieve it. And the CCC's job is to advise the government as an independent body on what it needs to do to address climate change and to hold it accountable. I guess this word accountability crops up for what it has or hasn't done. Now, the task of identifying effective policies and measures must be evidence-led and underpinned by robust analysis of the opportunities and the costs of many different options. And I think this is one of the ways in which the CCC has established a very strong reputation in the UK for the kind of the rigor of its analysis and the kind of the transparency of it as well. So, okay, maybe some might say too much of it. There were 1,000 pages of stuff was published all in one go in December, all underpinning advice on the 6th carbon budget. So this carbon budget was another thing that was sort of set out in the Act in 2008. Legally binding limits for UK greenhouse gas emissions over 5-year periods as interim milestones on the way towards a long-term goal. And those budgets should be legislated 12 years in advance of the budget start date to give enough time for the government to develop and enact policies, and importantly for businesses and private individuals for that matter to invest in whatever measures are necessary to kind of go along with achieving that budget. And a 5-year period was chosen rather than annual targets to give a greater flexibility. So for example, so myself as an energy engineer, I know that how much energy is used and where it comes from is affected by just quite what the weather was that year. So there's sort of year by year variation. So you can see sort of how that works out over a few years. It also sets out something important about adaptation. The Act requires the government to set out its objectives for adapting to climate change that is already happening and can be expected to continue to happen, and to define a programme to implement those adaptation actions. I think, to be honest, it's not quite had the same impact on adaptation as on emissions reduction, and that's a challenge going forward. I mean, maybe one of the reasons for that is just how easy it is to measure it, to see what's being done, because we kind of maybe haven't always seen the impacts yet, or the impacts come about sort of relatively infrequently. It's different from being able to measure what the emissions are, I suppose. So originally when the Act was passed in 2008, there was a long-term goal of at least 80% below 1990 levels in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. That was based on advice from the CCC very early in its existence. And in 2019, in recognition of the Paris Agreement, CCC gave new advice that the long-term goal should be at least 100% below 1990 levels, and that goal of net zero should be achieved no later than 2050 for the UK's territorial emissions. So yeah, this independent body, the CCC, it includes, actually it's 2 committees covering mitigation and adaptation. The members should be expert, politically impartial, and supported by a secretariat that does a lot of the kind of hard graft of analysis and the initial drafting of the reports that we, of course, review line by line and modify, agree the kind of main advice that we want to present. And so it's very much a collective effort that we're all signed on to as members of, in respect to mitigation actions, the mitigation committee and adaptation, but actually we're also trying to kind of work much more closely together as 2 committees, recognizing that a lot of these actions are intertwined. So yeah, we also monitor progress. So that's done every year rather than just the every 2 years that I think Christina was talking about as part of the Paris Agreement. Although the adaptation advice is every 2 years as a kind of regular reporting, and then every 5 years there's a major report, a climate change risk adaptation report, and there's one coming up later this year. Now, the government is obliged to respond to the CCC's assessments. It's supposed to have an annual cycle of policy development. Yeah, in that policy development, I suppose, well, yeah, another thing worth saying in terms of what the Act says is that the CCC, in setting the carbon budgets, must have regard to a number of things. And this is a way, I suppose, an area in which I suppose we do get some criticism, regarded in some sectors as maybe being too conservative, maybe kind of not pushing the government hard enough or to reduce emissions fast enough. We're required to consider the climate science, the international circumstances, technology and its development, the economy and competitiveness, taxation and spending, fuel poverty, energy supplies, and then also differences across the different parts of the UK and in the devolved administrations. Now, another point, of course, I think I mentioned this already, the CCC is only advisory. Final decisions on the legislated targets and on all the policies to meet them rests with the government. However, the government should take account of the advice, and were it to diverge from what we've recommended, the government must set out the reasons why. And there are limited penalties for non-compliance that are kind of written into the Act. But I mean, rather, as I think Christina and Jimena were saying, it creates this framework for scrutiny and transparency. And this kind of naming and shaming, I suppose, is seen as being quite a potentially very powerful instrument should the government choose not to honour its climate commitments, or for whatever reason fail to honour it. I mean, if the actions, maybe policies were defined but didn't have the outcomes that maybe were anticipated. Final few things I'll just say before we kind of move on to Gerard and then a bit more discussion, is that Scotland, we have parallel legislation, the Climate Change Act Scotland from 2009. And it follows a similar sort of 4-pillar framework to the UK Act, sort of an end goal, interim targets, policies, and independent advice and monitoring. And the CCC is taken to be the main kind of independent advice body. And the Act set out a target originally, but it was amended in 2019 to set for Scotland a net zero emissions target to be reached by 2045. And that was based on CCC advice. It's consistent with the UK target of 2050, having regard to the initial situation and the resources that are available within Scotland. So it's kind of land and energy resources and so on. One difference, though, is the Scottish Act has annual targets rather than 5-year budgets. So just a final remark, what has all this achieved? Well, I think emissions have reduced significantly in the UK since this framework was brought in. I mean, I think action was already started before that, but it really kind of gave a much, I think, stronger focus to it. Reduced by kind of more than 50% so far relative to around about 50%, 48, something like that percent relative to 1990 levels so far. Of course, we've got to go a lot further. It's been unbalanced, though. Kind of the sectors in which we've done this emissions reduction, it's not been across the whole economy. The electricity sector, which is the sector in which I work, has contributed most of it. A lot of that is down to the development and utilization of renewables. And again, that's sort of part of my day job, actually, as an electrical engineer. My work and my group's work, the department I'm part of, we do a lot of work on the grid integration of renewables. And although we've achieved a lot, actually the other 50%, if you like, is going to be really hard to achieve, because we've still got to make sure people have reliable energy supplies, and we're changing the physical characteristics a great deal. But I think another issue is that as far as individual citizens are concerned, these reductions have been achieved almost without noticing. Okay, electricity bills have been a bit higher than they would have been otherwise, but we haven't really had to change anything about what we do in our everyday lives. And that's not going to be the case in the next set of changes. We've got for us, a lot of emissions have to do with heating. We've got to change our heating systems. We're going to change the way we move about, get rid of our combustion engine vehicles and walk or cycle or work from home or use electric vehicles or whatever, public transport, whatever it happens to be. This is going to impact on us, but there's this kind of huge, benefits to be arrived at, cleaner air, much kind of better environment, maybe a better lifestyle, maybe perhaps better diet. And of course, we're part of this global community. So as an industrialized nation, we've really got to play our part. And in terms of some of the kind of, for me as an engineer, some of the technical challenges show that these challenges can be met, and we can do what we've said we're going to do. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Wonderful, Keith. Thank you very much for that. And I think we're also showing that many of the tools and mechanisms that seem to be important at the international level also play a role at the national level, but also for bringing it to Scotland towards the end of your remarks, because that's where I'll hand over to Gerard Howe, who, as I mentioned in the introduction of the panelists, leads work on climate change and on COP26 in particular in the Scottish government. Gerard, I think you wanted to share a few words also about Scottish climate policy, and of course what many in the audience, especially those in Scotland, will be curious about, and that's what does it mean for Scotland and where do we stand sort of progressing towards November and the negotiations?
Thanks so much, Michael, and thanks to my fellow panelists. It's been fascinating. So I put this background on specially because that building there is COP26 in November. This is the Scottish Exhibition Centre right behind me. So this is where the heart of COP26 will be. That river is the River Clyde, on which thousands of huge coal-burning ships were built and launched as Scotland and the UK exported its emissions over the years. So there's a bit of history that's really resonant for us in COP26 happening here. So I wanted to just give a brief perspective on Scotland, a brief perspective on Scotland's international work in terms of climate change, and a brief perspective on COP26 if I could. And I mean, I'll start with saying that it's pretty obvious, but Scotland is not a party to the Paris Agreement, but it is entirely committed to tackling the climate emergency. And that shapes an awful lot of what we do. And for those who don't know, Scotland, one of the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, 5 million people, famous for a whole bunch of things, and you can name some of them. But it's a great place to be. So, and actually, Keith, it was really good that sort of Keith has given us a segue, because I was going to start with just reinforcing the fact that Scotland's actions is based on law, and that's a really powerful framework for us. It is the most ambitious legislation framework in the world. Net zero 2045, world leading target of 75% emissions by 2030. The point that Keith made about those legally binding economy-wide emissions targets for every year is really, really important. So every year, and that's without reliance on international offsetting. And also within our legislation is a commitment to a just transition, ensuring fairness is at the heart of our approach. And that is one of the things that we'll come back to, because that's one of the things that we think is distinctive, not universally distinctive, but important to us about Scotland's approach. So those targets and the Act requires individual sector-by-sector monitoring reports to be laid before the Scottish Parliament annually. So as a mechanism for accountability to our Parliament, it feels very live. And let me tell you, working within the Scottish Government, that's a really important point for parliamentary scrutiny and also for public scrutiny of our progress. We also have a statutory framework for reporting on adaptation. I agree with Keith that we need to make more progress on adaptation, actually, and that's something that we'll need to come back to. And I was also going to raise the UK Climate Change Committee, because that's really, really important, because the transparency of advice to governments like Scotland and the UK is a huge way in which public debate happens and in which scrutiny happens. So the Scotland's Climate Change Act gives the committee a range of advisory functions, advising ministers on levels of emissions targets, preparing annual independent assessments of progress, and reviewing the landscape in Scotland. So that structure is what shapes us across the piece. But also in this piece, when we talk about transparency and accountability, it's also about the relationship, and you talked, Michael, about the court of public opinion, but it's about the relationship between the state and the citizen in Scotland and what that looks like. And a really important part of that over the last couple of years has been Scotland's Climate Assembly. Again, that was written into our Climate Change Act. And it said, this is the way that we're going to take a participatory approach to our decision making, and we're going to enshrine it in legislation. We have a public engagement strategy, which is also enshrined. And we're going to, and what the Assembly did was ask 100 people truly representative of the population of Scotland how to prevent or minimise the effects of climate change and make recommendations to government. And the question was, how should Scotland change to tackle the climate emergency in an effective and a fair way? That Climate Assembly will give a full report just at the end of this month, and ministers are legally required to respond in 6 months, just before COP actually. So that's going to be a really interesting point. And another thing I just wanted to flag up in Scotland's context was another commission that was established called the Just Transition Commission. And that final report is just issued in March, 24 recommendations. But again, how do we move through the climate emergency in a way that is just and fair? And for those that are not aware, this is partly because Scotland has a history of another industrial transition, which was neither just nor fair. And therefore it's learning from our past in terms of moving towards our future. Turning briefly to our international side, last year, the Scottish Government committed to publishing what was called Scotland's contribution to the Paris Agreement. So that's actually what we've termed an indicative nationally determined contribution. We feel that's really important in terms of Scotland's leadership on a global stage, whilst clearly not being a party to the Paris Agreement. But that will lay out and follow best practice of a nationally determined contribution, laying out our implementation of our net zero, which is largely contained in our climate change plan update published in December, 100 new policies throughout the piece. That's likely to be published, well, certainly before COP, possibly later on in the autumn around Scotland's Climate Week as that comes forward. But I also wanted to talk about three other parts of Scotland's international approach. One is a commitment to climate justice across all of those spheres of recognitional, procedural and distributive justice, which we think are really important. So Scotland's really proud to have one of the only 2 badged climate justice funds in the world, to really focus on equitable global development, and it's taken a people-centered human rights approach to that. And there was a commitment in the SNP manifesto, you may be aware we've just had an election, to double that climate justice fund going forward. I will here also just note that there was also a commitment to deepening a feminist foreign policy. And again, in terms of our global outreach and how we approach the climate emergency, a feminist foreign policy is a crucial part of that. Really, really pleased about that. And we've done some supporting organisations like WEDO in terms of women negotiators being able to get to Paris and actually manage through the COVID restrictions, which we know have affected women in disproportionate ways to men. And that's had an impact on female negotiators too. So climate justice is a really important part of that. And thinking in terms of a global accountability, the power and the need to be really listening to voices of those communities most affected by climate change. So in the run-up to COP, we're also launching a series called Glasgow Dialogues, along with colleagues in Scotland, where colleagues from communities and governments most affected are bringing their perspectives, and we want to see that reflected as strongly as possible in COP going forward. The other way that Scotland engages is as part of what's called the Under 2 Coalition. So that's a coalition of 220 states and governments who are not parties to the Paris Agreement, but represent nearly 1.5 billion people, 43% of the global economy, and who have been taking really strong action on the climate emergency. Scotland is the co-chair of the European part of the Under 2 Coalition. And we think that there's enormous potential for that coalition to go even further. So we are supporting a range of learning secondments, including on how to move towards net zero, how to build accountability and transparency in climate action through that group. There's more that we can do, but 55% of those states and regions who are reporting are showing greater ambition than their national counterparts. We know about the C40 as a mechanism. I think that's been very, very successful. We also want to make sure that states and regions are delivering in the same way. And there's lots of things that would make states and regions really effective, that including proximity to populations and ability to integrate actions in some ways that national parties maybe struggle a bit more to. And transparency is a critical part of the learning that we want to bring to that, but we need to go further and faster. And then lastly, turning to the event that will happen behind me. So what does this mean in terms of COP26? Well, at a macro level, Nigel Topping talks about the 2 things that COP26 should be known for. And I think we in the Scottish Government absolutely underscore that. And that's action and solidarity. And those 2 feel utterly critical. I think we're thinking very much, we as a government have set our targets, we're on our way, we've made that bold, ambitious statement. It's now all about delivery. And I think that's the really, really important shift that we would like to see happening at COP26 as well. So a shift from ambition to results, from ambition to accountability, moving that forward feels like a really important pivot point for COP. And we know that one of the other features of COP26 is that requires a whole of society approach. It's not just states making those announcements, but it's about how communities, households, cities, non-states and parties, businesses, not the voluntary sector, all get engaged to move from that forwards. And I would like COP26 to find new ways of exercising that climate accountability going forward. That requires humility, actually, and ability to talk about failure. It's hard, this sort of stuff. And as a government that set a really ambitious target, you know, as Keith knows, we are going to come under criticism at times for not always being in step with that target. But actually, it's going to take bravery to talk about that and bravery to bring other people into thinking about that going forward. And I think also for Scotland, making COP26 meaningful to people is really, really important. Again, back to that court of public opinion, making it feel in Scotland like it's not just an event that happens in that building, but it's an event that matters to people right across Scotland. So at the practical level, the Scottish Government has got two themes for COP26. The first is people, and that's predominantly about inclusivity and representation. And the second is just transition, which you're not surprised by. We've got, if you like, three themes. The first is about keeping our promises, meeting our commitments and moving to action. The second is keeping people at the heart of all we do. And the third is about living our values, which is about bringing a focus on fairness and equity into all we do. Our key sectors for us are going to be on nature, just transition, the power and the voice of young people, public engagement, nature and energy. And the public engagement is really important. Again, Keith mentioned this. The Climate Change Committee has said that 70% of the emissions reductions to come are based on people's behaviour change. We've had silent success in a way, as Keith said, up to now. We now need to move to a different phase. And that means, hopefully, an open, engaging, transparent event behind me and right across Scotland and elsewhere in the country. It's going to be really hard in the context of COVID. We know there are some hugely important debates about global vaccine equity. You've seen what Greta Thunberg's already said about that. The UK government, the Scottish government has responsibility for health. Health is a devolved matter. We are working really closely with the UK government. Our ambition is to hold a vibrant in-person COP whilst protecting the public health of people as far as we possibly can, and making that bold statement. The world needs COP26 to happen. We'll do our best to make that happen. Thanks so much, Michael.
Thank you, Gerard, for, well, I should say inspiring also. Last round in the panel, and for bringing in this aspect of justice, fair or just transition, which I think is really part of what Christina and Jimena already were speaking about. This is not only when we talk about accountability, about punishment, about coercion, it's about facilitation, because in many cases, countries around the world, communities don't have the capacities, the abilities to do what we tell them they have to do. So it's equally about making sure that they can do it in the first place. But after this rich, rich tapestry of insights, starting with Christina and then going through each of the panelists, I wanted to give Christina a chance to comment and respond whether there's anything that she wanted to pick up, elaborate on. And before doing that, I also want to once again remind our attendees that they can enter questions anytime they want in the Q&A function. So there should be a button at the bottom of your screen. And also you can upvote questions that are visible already from other attendees. If you find them particularly interesting, want to make sure that they get answered, because I will be going through that, the questions in that sequence as they're shown on the screen. To you, Christina, do you have any sort of thoughts, reflections on these rich comments from the three panelists that you've just heard?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jimena and Keith and Gerard. This is really a very rich tapestry of topics, and it's very interesting how they fit together. Well, first to Jimena, thank you so much for taking us back to the negotiations of Article 15 and the fact that we do have a compliance committee, it is a fact now, and people do not know how difficult that was. By the end of the day, it was almost a miracle that we ended up with it, because, as you perhaps know, it was not part of the Durban Mandate, which set out the different elements for the Paris Agreement. It was something that really, through a lot of hard work, had to be negotiated, and there was a lot of outreach to all sorts of countries to make them see the benefits of such an element. And until the very last evening, really, and you shared that last evening, it wasn't given. So it was actually a really hard fight and a success that we saw them. And now it's so important to make it work and worthwhile. And that's why the committee members are incredibly dedicated to get to these rules in place and then hopefully show the world how this committee is meant to work. And just picking up on the things, that last thing that Gerard mentioned, it is facilitative in nature, because if you sit back and ask for a second, what could be the reasons for parties not complying with their obligations? And in many, many cases, it is probably a capacity issue or a technological issue or something with the clarity of the rules. There may be cases of just simply unwillingness, but they are the exception. The main reasons may be that there are some capacity constraints. And that is exactly where the committee is supposed to kick in and engage with the party and say, what is the problem? How can we help? Do you need additional, people or funds or technology? And therefore the facilitative element is so important. Also to Keith, it's very interesting, and I've been following the UK Climate Change Act for ever since it came into existence, and it's very interesting to see its strength and target and how it aligns with the Paris Agreement. So it's a very wise piece of legislation, which obviously has had its immediate effects already. I just wanted to point out to this issue of, you talked about just transition and putting things not to the future, and you probably know we've just had a very interesting decision from the German Constitutional Court, which draws in this element of intertemporal justice, that we have to take measures today, because otherwise we just roll over to future generations a lot of really tough restrictions on their potential liberties in the future. And that element of transitional justice, I think, is very important, because these are young people today, which may grow up into a future which is very constrained in terms of what they can do compared to what we are still able to do. And Keith just mentioned, we just pay a little bit more for power, but in the future, and that's a very close future, life will have to change very drastically in order to get to these climate greenhouse gas or carbon neutral goals that we're now seeing being adopted all over the world. That's just a brief reflection on the different presentations. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christina. And again, thanks to all panelists. We have a bit under half an hour, and I think we have a good list of really interesting questions. I'm sure you've also been browsing, the list of questions in the Q&A. And let me just start from the top, and let's see how far we can get. Hopefully we can address most of them, maybe even all, in the remaining time. The first one is by Birgit Hollaus. I hope I pronounced it correctly, and I think it's directed to Christina. Now, she thanks you, of course, for your insights, but then she talks about the competence of the committee in relation to systemic issues, and whether you think that this competence may turn into further teeth for the committee and the whole process in the event that, for instance, we identify problems with the overall level of ambition in the NDCs, and could the committee then provide guidance on that on a much more systemic level, or similar situations? Anything that you can say to that?
That's a really interesting question, and I've been asked similar things. What can that systemic issue do in order to push up ambition? Now, the way it was designed is that if there is anything in the rules or the guidelines for parties that makes it difficult for parties to implement or comply, and that happens for, again and again for different parties, and thereby there's an indication that maybe the rules don't fit, maybe the timelines are too short or too long or too unclear. Something that is rules-based, that is something that the committee can deal with and tell the CMA, hey, listen, maybe you should revisit those rules, they just don't work. But what the committee cannot do is, to push political willingness. That is something that is pretty much outside the scope of the committee, and it won't be able to do this in a very direct manner, as you seem to suggest in your question. But having said that, that systemic issue is still a bit of a black box, and we haven't really, it's something that happened in the last minute in Katowice, where it was added to the committee's mandate, and it was perceived by the parties to the peer-to-peer agreement that it might be good to have that kind of, somebody looking at systemic challenges. But it will be, we have to see what the committee makes out of it in the years to come, and what kind of systemic issues it may be able to point to. But it's very difficult to say this from the outside, how this function will evolve over time.
In other words, it is history in the making. Yes, please, Jimena. Absolutely.
Yes. Just one thing about the systemic issues, which what Christina was mentioning, is that, for example, one thing that one can find is that in all these reports that we need to file and send, you can, for example, in the overview, you can tell, oh, this question is ill-written, or there is, or parties are having problem with this specific issue systemically, and that the committee might dedicate their work to that at the beginning, because specific cases might not come so far, as fast. So systemic issues are a very interesting part of the work of the committee once we get it moving, and I hope, Christina, you will have that soon. So you will see that when you start the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimena. Keith, please.
I'll maybe throw in, the bit that Christina mentioned there about, well, you can't get into the political will aspects, that's out with the sort of the defined scope of the committee. But it's the political will that certainly my opinion here in the UK is that is really crucial, of course, to get the right sort of direction. Maybe we've been a bit lucky over the last kind of few years. Don't know what you think, Gerard, but there's been basically all party agreement within the UK that doing something about climate change is the right thing to do. But at the same time, well, it's been fantastic progress. The UK government has accepted the advice on the 6th carbon budget. We've got an NDC that is consistent with that we put forward, that follows the CCC's advice. We're very pleased about that. International aviation and shipping, for the first time, has been accepted by the UK government as being part of the carbon budget. But the action to deliver it now is really the test. And this is really going to test the political will, I think. And that's something I think we feel in the CCC we're going to be paying much more attention to, is, are the policies in place, and then are the outcomes following from those policies?
Gerard, please.
Yeah, if I may just follow up, I think that's a really important point. And it also goes back to that solidarity point earlier on, because I think that's about helping, internationally, people understand and work their way through those delivery challenges, as well as there is, of course, always going to be a political context going forward. So I'd agree with that. The only other point I'd say is that it's even harder in a context of COVID recovery. And we are, fiscally, it's really hard. And actually, we've just been looking, and I'm sure people have seen recent research on people's attitude towards climate change, both accelerated in some senses, but also there's a lot of people that want to get back to life after COVID in some ways, at least in the UK right at the moment. And that doesn't necessarily align with where we want to go. So I think presents a series of challenges at a political level as well. Thanks.
Thanks to all. I apologize for my cat Zoom bombing me. She holds me accountable regularly. So going back and sort of respecting the votes of the attendees, I'll head to the next question, which still remains at this international level, and I think links a little bit to the previous question. It's from my colleague Antonio Cardesa Salzman at Strathclyde Center for Environmental Law and Governance, and he's comparing sort of the implementation and compliance committee that you are a member of and described, Christina, and that you helped negotiate, Jimena, with the with the Kyoto Protocol's compliance committee, pointing to that the Kyoto committee may have had some more teeth in certain regards, for instance, in use of the flexibility mechanisms, yet generally was thought to underperform, and whether maybe that trade-off, having perhaps less sort of visible teeth, nonetheless may help it become more relevant. Would you concur that there might be something behind that?
Well, I certainly hope so. I certainly hope so. We many of the negotiators in Paris had, of course, the Kyoto Protocol Compliance Committee in mind, with its two branches, the facilitative branch and the enforcement branch, and looked at what these branches can do. But we also were very aware that the context and the structure and the architecture of the Paris Agreement is very different from the Kyoto Protocol. We don't have any, top-down designed quantified obligations. Parties have their NDC, so it's a very different starting point, which means that, for example, the punitive measure under the Kyoto Protocol Compliance Committee, that if a party does not comply with its goal, the committee can then enhance the target in the second commitment, though we only had two period, that didn't fit in the context of the Paris Agreement. It was a no-go. We couldn't work with that. It is tailored to the needs and the structure of the Paris Agreement. But I think that actually makes it stronger, because it is very, very carefully designed to fit how the Paris Agreement is designed, and is complementary to the entire rationale of the Paris Agreement. I mentioned, it doesn't link back to the eligibility to participate in the flexibility or the carbon market under Article 6. Yeah, but again, this is a very different context from Kyoto. So it's hard to compare. It's almost apples and pears if you start looking into the details. But I think it is stronger because it is tailor-made to the designs and the needs of the Paris Agreement's parties.
Jimena, I think you raised your hand briefly, or did Christina answer? Go ahead.
Briefly, just to say that as a long-serving member of the Kyoto Protocol Compliance Committee, I will not feel offended by the question. By the fact that he said that we underperformed, but also to insist that what Christina is saying, that there were very different circumstances. Then it was specifically designed for Annex 1 countries, committees, commitments. So it was very different. And with the Paris Agreement, we managed to, as Christina was saying, made a specific body for the specific situation of Article of the Paris Agreement. So thank you for that.
Thanks for that addition, Jimena. Any comments from Gerard or Keith? No problem. It is very much, I think, geared to the international lawyers here. There's a quickly answer question at the very end. Malcolm of Strathclyde asked about the name of the cat. It's Cookie, just to get this one out of the way. So the next question up on the list, also upvoted by several attendees, is an interesting one, I find, because I don't see a very sort of clear and straightforward answer. And I think all of you might have interesting opinions on this. And it was about the interaction or complementarity, potentially at least, of compliance and transparency mechanisms, such as the one in the Paris Agreement, with what we're seeing all around the world. Christina mentioned the recent Federal Constitutional Court case in Germany. There's litigation in the UK, there's litigation in many other European nations and many countries around the world, with this phenomenon of growing sort of domestic litigation in national courts and tribunals and international courts and tribunals as well. Do you see interactions there? How would you say, if you wanted, that there is a complementarity potentially?
That is a fantastic question, really. I mean, that gets, the lawyers going. It's a really good one. And I think there are several points of interaction. Let's just start with the NDC, where I said NDC communication, weak accountability, nobody reviews the NDCs under the Paris Agreement. Just an example. I don't judge on it. It's just an example that I provide, and you can think about yourself. Parties were supposed to or requested to provide updated or updated or enhanced indices in 2020. Now, of course, we've seen several NDCs coming forward, and some of them did not progress compared to the previous one. There is nothing in the Paris Agreement that picks that up. But if you read the agreement itself, there's an expectation that they should progress. What happened is, for example, in Brazil, there was criticism about Brazil's new first NDC, or whatever they called it, that was not progressing compared to the previous one, which Brazil submitted in 2015. So a group of young people in Brazil took this issue to a domestic court. It's where it still is, but they used the information publicly available in the interim registry, and they used the rules in the Paris Agreement and took it to a domestic court. This is just an example of how that publicly easily accessible information can be used and then put in a domestic legal context. Whatever comes out of it, I don't know. It's just an example. Another example is the your cat is fantastic, Michael. Is the reports done under the transparency framework. We don't have them yet. As I said, they will first be submitted in 2024, but we will see. In these reports, parties have to say how well they're doing in implementing and achieving their NDC. So the first time, parties will have to publicly say, we're not doing that well, or yes, we're doing great. But this is going to be information that can be immediately used in domestic context, because many parties have included their NDC targets into national legislation, like the UK Climate Change Act. And there it becomes legally binding. Even on an international level, it's not legally binding, your target, but in national law, it is legally binding. And you combine the national legislation with internationally publicly available information, and you put these two together, and you may have an interesting case. And finally, with the compliance committee, okay, this is not a direct link, and I don't want to be quoted on that, but of course, if the committee finds that a party is not complying with its core legal obligation, let's say a party does not have an NDC, no NDC, and the committee says, hey, party, you don't have an NDC, and it goes over years, and finally it's a statement of fact, but the party still doesn't have an NDC. What is that? It's an internationally wrongful act. You know, the party has not complied with an internationally legally binding obligation. And that is something, you know, that can be taken to an international court if you find somebody who is a claimant. But of course, that can, you know, that statement does not prevent any international litigation based on a party not complying with its obligation, because these obligations apply erga omnes partes in between the parties to the agreement. So they're then not direct linkages. There's no direct link to any court, but there are several indirect linkages where just the accessibility of information or the findings by the compliance committee can be used in international or national legal proceedings. And the final point on that, it's a very interesting development that we see in free trade agreements, bilateral regional free trade agreements, for example, the ones in the making between the EU and Mercosur, or EU-China, which also take in the compliance with the Paris Agreement, even with NDCs. And that's an interesting one because, well, depending on how this ends up in the end, these agreements have access to investment arbitration. We'll see if this is going to be linked up, but there could be a link also, an infection of the findings of the Paris Agreement Compliance Committee in the context of investment arbitration under those bilateral free trade and investment agreements.
Thank you very much. Any thoughts from the other panelists? Keith, please.
Straying into a subject area that's not my own of the kind of legalities here, but I think there was kind of three things in particular I was going to Christina prompted. One, that last point about the link of free trade agreements, there's a lot of discussion, as you know, around the European Union in particular, and a bit in the UK about border carbon adjustments. So that is, if you like, that's that link, I guess, you know, coming through, and we're talking about, I don't know if I haven't got the conversation that well developed in the UK yet, but it's in there. The importance of transparency, again, that's come up quite a few times, hasn't it, this afternoon. You know, once somebody can see what is the performance, then it is possible for that to be challenged in the court of public opinion, for example, as well as in the law courts at whatever kind of jurisdiction. So that transparency is a really important lever and enabler. Although, on the other hand, I mean, I'm sure you've heard this lots of times, Christina, so please forgive me, but, you know, taking years to establish a point of fact obviously doesn't seem quite satisfactory when it's, you know, action that has to really be taken, especially in the industrialized parts of the world, really quite urgently. So maybe that's a bit of a sort of a challenge, I suppose.
If I can just chip in here, we already mentioned the German case, which is really fascinating to read, and it's actually quite difficult to read. Judgment is 110 pages long. But it is interesting because in that case, the German Federal Constitutional Court, amongst different things that it did look at the Paris Agreement goal and translate it into a national carbon budget for Germany, which it set up at 6.7 gigaton until it has to be carbon neutral, which is very interesting. But here we have an example where a court, directly referred to the Paris Agreement and translated that into domestic obligation. Well, given that, of course, that the Germany had included or referred to it in its Climate Protection Act. But it's very interesting development, something along the lines that you just mentioned, that we have that international framework, but it makes it much more, I wouldn't say easier, but accessible for judges and for courts to rely on it, also on the science behind it, which is provided by the IPCC. And we see quite consistent scientific reference across these different judgments all over the world.
Great. That was actually, I think, a very elaborate answer to a tricky question, because it is sort of unfolding a new terrain in many ways. The next question is something I have to parse a little bit and hopefully interpret correctly. It's by Arun, and it's about how this whole non-compliance process internationally relates to climate finance. He cites the commitment, it's not expressly mentioned in the Paris Agreement, but it is sort of understood that that's it, that was originally made in Copenhagen, of $100 billion per year by 2020, and going beyond that even now under the new regime. And how would that be potential? This is where I hope I interpret it correctly. What would happen if developing country parties are lagging behind in reporting in their own actions? Would that have any implications, for instance, also for the developed country commitments regarding climate finance?
Well, it's another
Jimena.
important question, and important to answer to it, because, and maybe Jimena was about to say that what we had to consider in the negotiations for the mandate of the compliance committee was that it would only look at individual obligations, not collective obligations. And the finance obligation in terms of how much finance needs to come, and that 100 billion goal as a floor, which is referred to in the decision from Paris, is a collective goal. No single party can achieve it. They can only collectively reach it and go above and beyond. So that's outside the scope of the committee, at least in terms of individual obligations, which it will look into it. In terms of finance, the only individual obligations is whether a developed country party has provided its information on finance, and both ex ante and ex post finance, it goes through different channels, but it's a procedural obligation to provide a report on finance. But how much is actually being provided in terms of money, that is not part of the committee's work, because it's a collective obligation, not an individual.
Jimena, did you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you. And we also, and going back to the travaux préparatoires, which is this background behind the negotiations, we also needed to be very careful that the compliance committee does not become an ATM machine, somewhere where you go as a party to say, I'm having problem with finance, please give me finance, because that was not the purpose behind it. So of course there is a relationship between these mechanisms of financial support and the compliance committee, but it's more in the way of, are you having trouble? Are your troubles complying is because you don't have sufficient funding, as Christina was mentioning before. Then let's look at what are the options under the Paris Agreement framework, which are many. So the answer of the committee in those cases will be, you can go here, you can go here, you can go here where the funds are. So that we didn't want to establish a too direct relationship between as I said, the committee and the funding mechanisms, because it was not the purpose behind it. But of course there is a relation which will go through the financial mechanisms under the Paris Agreement.
Understood. Thank you very much. Yes, please, Gerard.
So I think that's all obviously absolutely right. But the thrust of the question right? Which is absolutely right. There was this collective agreement to hit the floor of this amount of finance, and as far as we can see at the moment, we are going to be nowhere near it. Right now, that can't be treated in a sort of a compliance exactly as Jimena sets out through the compliance committee, but it is still something that is a valid discussion to be had at a level of, you know, collective multilateralism and what people are doing. And certainly right at the moment, you know, colleagues in the UK government, the COP president delegate is going around the world virtually and physically, saying to people, including in developed economies, where are your plans to contribute to a decent amount to get to that 100 billion floor, right? And again, one of the successes of COP26 will be if we move further towards that floor than we are now, because we're woefully away from it. So whilst it's not a compliance issue, it's absolutely a moral issue, and it's absolutely intrinsic to the success of all the actions we're setting out. And it's something that should come under scrutiny and people should be held accountable for at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We're getting close to the full hour, and it's been, I mean, it is a long 2-hour webinar, and I know all of us have busy schedules, so I don't want to go more than at most maybe 2 or 3 minutes over. That gives us perhaps time for 2 more questions. One, I think, Jimena, you already identified in the Q&A list that you'd like to address, and this would be by Stacey Alvarez. And it's a question about the membership of the committee that Christina described in one of her slides, and maybe why small island development states, the SCELG group, seems to only have 1 member there. And could there be more representation from these regions at some point in the future?
Yes, thank you, Stacey. But the fact that there is an additional member of the small island developing states is in itself a recognition for them, because you have to take into account that usually these committees the membership are like 3 or 5 members from each region of the United Nations, and so that's the usual membership. And in this case, we added a member from the small island developing states. So island will be represented, for example, in my region, in GRULAC, the Latin American region, we have all the Caribbean islands. So basically what we will do when we designate our member to the committee is that one will come from the islands, while we come from the Central America, and the other from South America. So there you will have also a chair for an island. The same in, let's say, Asia and Africa. They will provide that the islands are also represented. So the additional seat is actually, I mean, that seat that you refer to, it's actually an additional seat for additional chair, sorry, for the small island developing states. Thank you.
I hear in the chat that Gerard has to really leave sharp on the hour. So I'll jump one question to Tom Foote's question about the need to make COP26 meaningful and impactful. And he invites Gerard, but also the other panelists to maybe comment briefly on what this transition to virtual negotiating that we've had over the last almost 1.5 years now as a necessity during the pandemic, how that will affect the process, and what you, Gerard, and your colleagues are doing to help still ensure that it becomes the milestone it has to be for a successful outcome.
Well, I'd be really interested in Jimena and Christina's view on virtual negotiation. I mean, everything we're seeing at the moment is actually the UN cannot operate a virtual negotiation, and it is illegal for many member states to make decisions virtually still, so, or sign up to binding commitments. So that's hard. I think making the most of COP is about focusing on the things that really matter, telling the story really clearly, and making sure that we understand how to use this opportunity. The debate that we're having in Scotland is how do we best use this opportunity both to contribute to the global climate emergency, but also that to Scotland's own ambitions towards net zero in a just and fair way. And that's a very precious opportunity. So probably less is more and focus is all. But as far as I can see, there is not going to be a virtual COP. I don't think that's possible, nor I think is it desirable because of reasons of inclusivity. Thanks.
Thank you, Gerard. Before you leave, let me maybe already thank everybody on the panel. I think, unfortunately, we do have to wrap up. I promised Francesco that he would have an opportunity to say some very final words announcing future events and developments. But not only thank you all for your insights, for the expertise you shared with us today, for taking time, but also for the work you do, whether it's on committees or as negotiators, government officials, or in your research. This is hard work. There's many extra hours, a lot of unpaid work as well, and you're doing it on the behalf of all of us. So thanks for what you're doing. Godspeed, and stamina in the next rounds of your respective responsibilities and obligations. And again, thanks for joining us today. To the audience for great questions. I now hand over to Francesco and the wonderful team at SCELG, of course, for helping make this happen.
Thank you very much, Michael. Just give me 30 seconds, a minute to formally close the 5th SCELG Biennial Guest Lecture. It's been an absolute pleasure. I learned a lot. I enjoyed it tremendously. And as I said in the chat, I thank all of you, but in particular, I thank Christina for accepting this invitation. A bit like Michael, Christina and I have known each other for quite some time. I don't know if it was her first presentation, but it definitely was my first presentation at an international conference, that I was sitting next to her in the panel, quite nervous and trying to make a fool of myself. And now here we are, sometime later, organizing the SCELG Biennial Guest Lecture. So I'm really, really happy that you said yes, that you could come. We have met here in Scotland and in Norway physically, in person, and we'll do it again. And why not? We'll do it again at COP26. The topic of compliance was something extremely important, like Jimena also mentioned at the beginning. Let's not kid ourselves. It is complex, it is technical, it is legal. But I think, and I'm really happy that Keith was here, that Gerard was here, it is a topic that lawyers need, and we do it, but we need to do it even more, talk about these issues with non-lawyers. And one point that Christina mentioned is that the membership of the Compliance Committee is not just lawyers, and that is incredibly important. And I do think that a guest lecture like this shows that law, like engineering, is a skill, and it has our language, our terminology, our nuances, but it is something that we can and we have to share with other disciplines. And this is an effort to do that. It also links with not just international climate law, it links with national climate law. We talked about litigation, for example, and this is something that will happen even more after 2024. I think 2024 is a key date for the Compliance Committee work and for the future of the international climate change legal regime. I leave it by hoping that all of you, including the participants, can join us at COP26. The University of Strathclyde has great plans. Keith, myself, Michael, and everybody at SCELG and the university are really excited of welcoming you in our beautiful city. And obviously not only have a successful COP26 when it comes to the negotiations, when it comes to the momentum towards fighting against climate change, but also having a successful and safe 2 weeks together in Glasgow. So I'll leave it to that. Again, thanks to everybody, to those who are now with me, Michael, with Keith, with Jimena, with Christina, with all the participants. And in 2 days, we have the last SCELG seminar with Anna Bertisuman. The link is in the chat and everything, and I do hope you can join us also for that. There are other webinars on the horizon, one also with Christina and Michael, organized by the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, with the relationship between legislation and litigation when it comes to climate change, a very fascinating topic, and I hope that you can join us also for that. I'll leave it there. We can all go get a much deserved cup of coffee or whatever you want. And I hope to see you at the next SCELG Biennial Guest Lecture in 2 years' time. And obviously much before as well. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you again.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.